The farmhouse was older than the dirt it sat on, gray wood weathered by years of storms and wind that smelled of rain and distant corn. Annie liked that about it, the way it leaned slightly as if it were bowing to the sky. Character, she called it. Mark called it rotting under his breath, but he smiled all the same when Annie spun through the creaking front door, laughing like a child. They were tired of the city, the noise, the traffic, the stale air filled with car exhaust and burnt coffee. So they came here, to a patch of nowhere in rural Maine, far from Boston's smog, where fields stretched in waves, green and swaying like the sea. At first it was idyllic. By the third day, Mark noticed how fast the crops were growing. Rows of corn in the backfield had shot up nearly a foot overnight. He scratched at his stubble as he stood on the porch, sipping bitter coffee. "Miracle grow, huh?" he muttered. Annie knelt at the garden's edge. "It's not just the corn. Look at these tomatoes. The vines weren't even this long when we moved in." They both stared as fat, ripe tomatoes sagged heavily on the stalks, their skins glistening red like polished apples. The leaves looked too green, too vibrant, as if someone had painted them. By the end of the week, the grass had swallowed the fence posts. It was old Mr. Danner from the feed store who gave them their first warning. Mark had stopped by for nails and some wood. The old man leaned across the counter, lowering his voice like a conspirator. "Fields'll fool you this time of year," Danner said, peering out from under his ball cap. "They like to drink." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Drink?" Danner nodded. "Blood." He tapped a weathered finger on the countertop. "Why you think these hills stay green when everything else is dying off?" Mark laughed it off on the drive home. Farmers and their tall tales, he thought. Annie would get a kick out of it. Maybe they'd joke about it over dinner. But when he pulled into the gravel driveway, Annie was on the porch, shaking, staring at something. He followed her gaze to the garden. The vines had crept out across the yard, thick tendrils of green and brown, twisting toward the porch steps like fingers clawing for purchase. At the vine tips, sharp little thorns like tiny teeth. "We need to go inside," Annie whispered. "Something's wrong." That night, Mark woke up sweating. His dreams had been thick and heavy, filled with whispers from beneath the floorboards and the sensation of soil pressing down on his chest. When he swung his legs over the bed, he felt it, roots. Thin black tendrils had slipped up through the floorboards, curling like veins around his ankles. He kicked free and scrambled for the light. Annie screamed from the hallway. He ran, heart hammering, to find her pressed against the wall as a thick root snaked from a vent, pulsing slightly as it reached for her. Mark hacked at it with a dull kitchen knife until the root bled black sap onto the floor, writhing like a dying animal. They tried to leave the next morning, threw clothes into bags and tossed them in the back of the old pickup truck. The cornfields loomed tall around the driveway, too tall, towering like monoliths. When Mark tried to reverse, the engine sputtered and died. The air smelled thick, metallic, like pennies and rust. The crops whispered in the breeze, leaves brushing each other like chattering teeth. In the distance, the other farm stood quiet, empty. Not a soul, not even the crows. That night, the dreams returned. Mark saw the harvest god. It rose beneath the farmhouse, an enormous gnarled mass of roots and flesh, with a face carved of bark and hollow eyes dripping sap. Its mouth yawned open, a pit of wriggling vines and bone. It spoke without words, promising fertile fields in exchange for sacrifice. It whispered of old rituals, of the blood that kept the earth alive, of how generations had fed it. Mark woke to the sound of dirt shifting beneath the floorboards. Annie was gone. The sheets next to him were stained with muddy water, and the smell of wet soil filled the room. He found her outside at the edge of the garden, standing barefoot, arms limp at her sides, eyes wide and empty. The vines curled around her legs, slithering up beneath her nightgown like eager pets. "I can hear it," she murmured. "It's hungry." By morning, Mark knew the truth. There was no leaving. The harvest god wouldn't allow it. The farmhouse groaned as roots pushed through walls and windows. Vines wrapped around chairs and tables, dragging them into the earth. The floorboards split like dry bone, and from below came the warm, humid breath of the god beneath. Mark took Annie's hand as the house was swallowed whole, the fields outside green as ever, swaying in rhythm with the heartbeat beneath the soil. A week later, Mr. Danner stood at the edge of the property, tipping his cap. The fields had never looked better. They stayed longer than most, he said softly, watching the new green sprouts that dotted the yard. Behind him, other farmers gathered, silent. You can smell it, one of them whispered. The offering, Danner nodded. A good harvest this year. They turned and left, leaving the house half sunken, vines coiling around the chimney like snakes returning home.